IBESS, Soil and Terrestrial Food Production Part 7, will focus on the inequalities that exist in food production and distribution around the world. The essential idea for this movie is the supply of food is inequitably available, and land suitable for food production is unevenly distributed among societies, and these inequalities can lead to conflict. Here is the first of two slides that outline the available movies in the Soil and Terrestrial Food Production Unit. Use this outline to find the movie you need for review. This movie can be found on the next slide. Here is the second of two slides that outline the available movies in the Soil and Terrestrial Food Production Unit. Use this outline to find the movie you need for review. This movie is focused right here. Here are the IB syllabus statements that drive the entirety of this movie. Review these statements as need be. Inequalities exist in food production and distribution around the world. The supply of food is inequitably available, and land suitable for food production is unevenly distributed among societies, and this can lead to conflict. Here is a broad outline of the factors that result in inequalities in food production and distribution around the world. Take some time to study this slide and look over this outline. We're going to start with looking at ecological issues that contribute to food inequalities. Abiotic factors vary across the globe in the form of gradients of light, temperature, and water. Zonation is apparent if you examine the change in temperature, light, and water from the equator to the poles. This should be familiar to you. The zonation present with the abiotic factors impacts NPP, food availability. Here is a table displaying net primary productivity in different biomes. Net productivity is high in equatorial locations and low in desert locations. Locations such as temperate deciduous forests are less warm than equatorial locations, but more warm than polar locations. Temperate deciduous forests have less water than equatorial locations, but more water than polar locations. Thus, NPP in the temperate deciduous forest is intermediate relative to the tropical forest or the tundra biomes. Notice the relatively low NPP for grassland. Now, grasslands experience long, dry seasons, accounting for the relatively low NPP there. This is where irrigation water would serve to increase NPP for the purposes of growing more food. Variations in the spatial and temporal distribution of light, temperature, and water influences production. Consider tropical versus polar locations. Palm oil plantations are found in tropical regions where there are higher levels of productivity because they're warm and wet. Many rice varieties require water. Rice won't be grown in abundance in dry locations. Let me remind you that we are looking at the ecological influences on the inequalities in food production across the world. Palm oil production does not occur in dry locations. When agricultural fields are left bare due to the cold winter, this influences available food. Also consider how the soil is being managed. Consider wind erosion. Water is important to primary productivity, but too much would limit productivity. Again, consider the ecological influences on the inequitably available food supply in the world and the uneven distribution of land suitable for food production. Certainly, too little water limits productivity. So, if it's not already clear, land suitable for food production is unevenly distributed among societies. Some land is very productive because its soil is rich, some less so. Some locations are warm and wet or experience high light levels, and some locations less so. Here is the outline of the factors resulting in inequalities in food production and distribution around the world. Now let's look at economic issues that contribute to food inequalities. In this graph, you can see that the price of wheat has varied greatly over the last 30 years. Now, explanations for the change in the price of wheat over time are complicated, but supply and demand play a role. But before we look at supply and demand, remember that if the price of food is high, food is less available to people who cannot afford to pay the high price. Later in this movie, I'll return to look at what fueled the high price of wheat in 2008, 2009. Here we have a supply and demand curve. Now, don't worry about gaining full control of supply and demand theory. Just listen to what I say over the next 4 slides to gain a somewhat intuitive understanding of the economics of food supply. Now, from the consumer perspective, if the price is high, then the demand for the product, the demand for a quantity is low. But if the price is low, then the demand for that quantity, the demand is high. Now, from the producer perspective, if the price is high, then the producers will have the incentive to produce more, increase supply. But if the price is low, then the producers will reduce supply. If demand increases, the demand curve shifts to the right, and supply remains unchanged, a shortage occurs, and this leads to a higher price. Remember, higher prices makes food less available for many people in the world. This is imbalance. If demand remains unchanged and supply increases, the supply curve shifts to the right. A surplus occurs, leading to a lower equilibrium price. How might technology influence supply? You might be able to imagine new technology that suddenly increases the harvest rate of a resource. This would increase the supply. This would cause the price to drop. This would potentially harm farmers, but in the short run, benefit consumers. If demand remains unchanged and supply decreases, the supply curve shifts left. A shortage occurs, leading to a higher equilibrium price. You might be able to imagine a drought or flood or crop disease that would decrease supply. Prices go up, making the resource less available for many. Certainly, natural disasters, whether they be droughts or floods or hurricanes, can result in food shortages and higher prices. Here is a graph of coffee prices over the last 20 years. Coffee, like some other crops, are often known as cash crops because the economy of a country is heavily invested in a single crop as a source of revenue, a source of money. If the price changes, as it often does according to world market fluctuations, the economy of a country or region can suffer. The world wheat price went up to nearly $12 per bushel in 2008, mostly because oil costs, input costs to the farms, also increased. Remember that agriculture is highly dependent on fossil fuels. You can see in this graph how the price for a barrel of oil also peaked in 2008. It was the high cost of oil that sent food prices skyrocketing and made foods unavailable for some societies in the world. Nutmeg, produced in certain Indonesian islands, or coffee across the world, are both cash crops. Regions that invest heavily in cash crops can suffer when the market declines. Governments often subsidize agriculture, resulting in lower prices in the market. In other words, prices that are lower than the actual cost of producing the product. You can see that the amount of subsidies given to various agricultural sectors in the U.S. on this slide. Now, governments that can afford to pay subsidies to their farmers put their farmers at an advantage over farmers who are not receiving subsidies. Farmers in countries without subsidies are at a disadvantage. For example, farmers in LEDCs, less economically developed countries, where subsidies are not provided, cannot compete well in the world market. This causes further financial stress in LEDC's countries that are often already poor. Now, as a side note, from this slide, you can see that U.S. subsidies most benefit farmers involved in the meat production. If meat and dairy receive larger subsidies than agricultural sectors that produce salad materials, a Big Mac might be less expensive than a salad. I hope that strikes you as contrary to fundamental ecological theory and the 10% rule. Now let's look at the technological factors involved in the global food imbalance. We'll take a quick look at machines, irrigation water, fertilizers, herbicides, pesticides, and hybrid seeds or genetically modified seeds. It's important whenever you write about technology that you be specific. Avoid simplistic statements like technology influences food supply and saying nothing more than that. MEDCs, more economically developed countries with mechanized planters, tillers, and harvesters, produce more food per square meter than regions within LEDCs that rely on less mechanized forms of agriculture. Technology does influence the rate of harvest of food. Those with the technology can harvest more than those without. High rates of harvest put renewable resources at risk of being harvested unsustainably. Machinery increases the capacity of farmers to increase planting density and increase the size of the area that can be planted. With hand tools, productivity is likely to be less because your planting density is less and the area that you can farm is less. This can lead to an imbalance in global food supply. Locations with irrigation technology can grow more food than regions with less irrigation. Agriculture requires water. Productivity increases with water. Human populations with the money to pump groundwater to the surface will grow more food than populations without the technology or the money to maintain the combustion engine pumps. While food is a renewable resource because its rate of harvest can be equal to or less than replacement, the water resources that support agriculture are often not used in a sustainable fashion. Groundwater is the only source of water in regions such as this one. And do you think the groundwater is being withdrawn at rates equal to or less than replacement? Remember, groundwater is moderately renewable. Careful management is required. As you look out of an airplane and see green circles like these, you should recognize what you're looking at. Food production is increased due to irrigation, often groundwater irrigation. Fertilizers, particularly nitrogen compounds such as ammonia or urea or nitrates, are spread onto farm fields to increase productivity. Farmers with the money to buy fertilizers will grow more food than farmers without the money to buy fertilizer. Fertilizers, or the lack of fertilizers, contribute to the global imbalance in food supply. Herbicides and pesticides increase productivity by removing pests, herbivorous insects, for example, or plant competitors, weeds. Farmers that have the money to buy herbicides or pesticides will end up with more food than farmers who do not have these chemicals. Industrial farms that can spread herbicides and pesticides using industrial-scale machines will end up with greater productivity than small-scale farms. Keep in mind that the use of these chemicals is expensive, so not all farmers have the capacity to use these chemicals, and thus their productivity is less. Here's the outline that I'm following, and now, last, for technologies that create the inequalities in food production. What about access to hybrid seeds or genetically modified seeds? Access to hybrid seeds have been very, very important to increasing productivity over the last 50 years. Farmers without access to hybrid seeds grow less food that contributes to the global imbalance of food supply. Genetically engineered crops that might be resistant to insects or micro better in salty soils or micro better even at colder temperatures will result in more food. Genetically engineered crops will be expensive. Farmers with the money to buy engineered seeds might grow more food than farmers without the means to buy these seeds, and all of this contributes to the global imbalance in food supply. And lastly, among all of the factors that contribute to a global imbalance in food supply, we have the socio-political influences. Rather than dig into the complexities of trade among countries, I will focus on conflict. Inequalities in food production and distribution exist among all societies. Not all markets look like this one. Distribution of food in some societies functions well, moving food to where there is a demand. Distribution in other societies functions less well. In some societies, people wait desperately for food and ultimately cannot get what they need. If there is political conflict, external factors either assist or inhibit the appropriate distribution of food. Not all societies have an abundance of food. External factors can assist or inhibit the appropriate distribution of food. Serious conflict shifts the balance of power and inhibits the normal buying and selling of food during times of peace. Conflict prevents farmers from growing food, thus contributing to the global imbalance in food supply as it's influenced by socio-political factors. Conflict interferes with the distribution of food from people who have food to those who do not. Conflict often makes it difficult to decide who should receive the food that's there to be distributed. Conflict contributes to the global imbalance in food supply. In the last slide of this movie, you can see land availability across the earth. Most of the land on Earth is not available for cultivation because it's ice, rock, or desert. About 21% or so is what humans already farm, with another 25% or so potentially available. In order to increase food supply, many would argue that we must increase the land under cultivation. Fine, but recognize that much of the area that is potentially available is arid, marginal land. Marginal lands have relatively low productivity levels, and irrigation water is likely to be required. We always need to be asking about the management of soil and water when we talk about agricultural systems. And what are the consequences of bringing tropical forests under cultivation? Deforestation would be the first consequence, and we could talk about the change in the Earth's biodiversity, or soil problems, or even changes in the water cycle due to a reduced amount of transpiration by plants. Can we really bring more land under cultivation? And that brings us to the end of IBESS Soil and Terrestrial Food Production, Part 7.